welcome to episode 60 of the Bitcoin Game. I'm Rob Mitchell. In episode 59, I presented part 1 of my interview with Dr. Back. It was an amazing Cypherpunk history lesson, right up through Adam getting involved in Bitcoin. I truly recommend giving it a listen. In this episode, we take a deep dive into Liquid, Blockstream's new federated sidechain to Bitcoin. I thought it was just a way for exchanges to send Bitcoin back and forth, but it's really a lot more than that. Here we go with a continuation of my interview with Dr. Back.
A couple of years later, Greg Maxwell picked it up and improved the protocol. So found a way to make them a bit smaller, reduced it from like 3 kilobytes of proof to 2.5, I think. And there's been subsequent work to improve that since then. And that has been implemented on Elements and Liquid, which are sidechains to Bitcoin.
So what came first, an interest in developing something based on payment channels or sidechains? What made you decide to form Blockstream?
The main area of technology that we were thinking of building and forming a business around was the sidechain concept. So at the time, Lightning hadn't been thought of in detail yet, though there was a slightly less flexible and less efficient variant called a payment channel, which had been known about, probably since 2010 or 11 or something. You'd have to look on the Bitcoin Talk archives. And the limitation with the original payment channels is they are unidirectional. So you'd need 2 channels to talk between people, because if I sent you, a tenth of a Bitcoin, I slowly use my channel up, and there'd be no way for you to send me my own money back on the same channel. So you'd need a channel in each direction, and then you'd exhaust the channel. And when the channel is exhausted, you'd have to create a new one. And so it could certainly be practical for, repeat payments. So because of the limitations, people didn't really focus on routing through it, that would have been possible. I mean, it's not a leap that would be possible. But the code breakthrough, there were 2 independent papers that had been worked on about the same time. So there was the Lightning paper by Joseph Poon and Taj Dreijer, and there was another paper called Duplex Payment Channels by Christian Decker. And they were working on similar ideas at the same time without knowing it. So I think, and the difference is that the breakthrough is that the channels are reversible. So you can send money back in the other direction. And then that makes it much more interesting to do multi-hop routing, and brings the likelihood that we can see recirculation of funds in a network sort of indefinitely, potentially, right, without closing the channels. And so basically the scalability comes down to how many transactions can happen on a channel during its life cycle. And if you can get indefinite recirculation, that can be a very long time. And if the channel closes are for exceptional circumstances only, like the other party seems to have become non-responsive, gone out of business, or lost their equipment, lost their keys, or something like that, then of course you need to close the channel to retrieve the funds that are stuck in it. But in normal usage, if it's able to recirculate, that's pretty amazing from a scalability perspective, because you get almost the same security properties as the underlying Bitcoin, but you get much better experience. You get very immediate final settlement, and you can also have better privacy because the information doesn't go on chain, and you can keep the channel going for a long time, and so get a lot of scalability from it.
It excites me, and I know you guys jumped on it too, right? You dedicated someone to working on Lightning pretty quickly after that, right?
Yeah, so we were lucky being able to hire Christian Decker, the guy who'd written the duplex payment channel paper, which was one of the Lightning, the two Lightning similar papers at the same time, as part of his PhD. So he completed his PhD in Bitcoin, like one of the first Bitcoin PhDs. in the distributed systems group at ETZH, which is a technical university in Zurich. And so we were able to recruit him to work on it. And the first person we hired to work on it was, while he was finishing his PhD, actually, was Rusty Russell, who's a quite well-known Linux kernel developer who implemented various parts of the Linux network stack. So he's quite an experienced kind of low-level and protocol, network protocol designer and protocol implementer. He'd taken a sabbatical from IBM where he was working to try to figure out how to scale blockchains, basically. So he had some ideas about sharding and tried to do that. And when Lightning came out, he figured, well, that would be even better. So he became interested to work on that. So we were able to offer him a job to work on it. So at this point, we have 3 people working full-time on Lightning, the C Lightning implementation. And Rusty and Christian have put a lot of effort into working with the other participants, the other companies and individual contributors on the open specifications for Lightning so that they can get interoperability. So yeah, it's obviously it takes time to implement something like that, but it's it's seeing quite good live use now, and there's a pretty impressive rate of new developers joining into the effort and building new wallets and applications on top of it. And the protocol has also become quite stable, and people are starting to work on a version 1.5, as it were, with some improvements that have been realized since and some limitations that were known, just broken down into multiple stages for time to deploy reasons.
Do you want to talk any more about Lightning, or do you want to move on to Liquid?
I guess we could talk about Liquid next because, yeah, that's another big topic.
And I feel like Liquid is exactly as kind of described it. I don't know, it feels like 2 years ago or something when it was discussed it would be between exchanges and stuff. And that seems to be exactly what's happened. Is it pretty much as it was envisioned?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a sidechain and there are a few variants of sidechains. So this is a federated one. So in place of miners is a group of block signers. Because Liquid's application is for exchange settlement use cases, the block signers end up being exchanges and market makers and people doing proprietary trading, so people like that. But those are just the block signers. So their role is to, well, they have a couple of roles, but for network transaction completion, their role is to sort of do the similar actions that miners do in Bitcoin, which is to collect transactions, group them into a block, and sign them and broadcast that. So Liquid is still a peer-to-peer network where users can, would be expected to run full nodes and verify blocks and transactions validity. So the block signers are basically the analog of miners, and the users can use the network in the same way as they would use Bitcoin, basically with a wallet and block explorers and keys and so forth. But one of the main uses would then be for traders to withdraw Bitcoins from an exchange on the Liquid network and store those Liquid Bitcoins or other Liquid assets in a wallet, a hardware wallet or a smartphone wallet or a desktop wallet, to store them in their wallet or to transfer them to other exchanges for trading purposes, to do arbitrage or to trade assets that are available on different exchanges. I mentioned assets there. So the Bitcoin network has one asset type, Bitcoin. The Liquid network has Liquid Bitcoin, which is transferred in from Bitcoin and can be sent back to Bitcoin at any time. But it also has assets that people can issue. So those are more similar to the assets in other systems like ERC20 tokens or what have you, except they're native to the chain. So the Liquid network would have Liquid Bitcoin and assets that people would issue, which could represent a gold storage token, like a gold ETF or physical gold certificate, or other kinds of attested assets or shares in a company and so forth.
Would they be as easy for just anyone to set up as, say, like counterparty tokens, or I guess ERC20 tokens, which I'm not sure how you set up, but I've worked with counterparty a bit.
So it'll be similar. So basically, you just need to use the tools to create a token, and in creating a token, you're going to choose the parameters, like how many tokens there are initially, and in Liquid, you get to choose whether it's possible to issue more in the future. So if you were creating tokens for stock in a company, you might want to issue more shares when you sought further funding in the future, for example. And so the way that works is you optionally create a reissuance token, which is a kind of coin, and that coin gives you authority to create more of the asset later. And so you store that in a wallet, that reissuance token. If you opt to not create a reissuance token, then you can't create more. That's it. That's the maximum number. And you then have the new coins in your wallet, which represent the asset, and you can transfer them to other people. So that's, it's just a special kind of transaction. So with the right tools, you can create one of those and pay the Bitcoin denominated transaction fee, which is related to the size of the transaction as in Bitcoin. But now, whether the asset would get listed by an exchange is a separable question, right?
Sure. So where is Liquid right now? I mean, are exchanges actually using it yet, or where are we?
So we had a beta running at the time of the Consensus conference earlier in the year. And I think at that time we had about 8 participant exchanges and so forth interested to use it. And at this point, it's gone from beta late last month into live status. So it's now using physical servers with hardware modules that have keys in them that do the block signing for security reasons, operated by exchanges and other market makers and prop traders that make up the network's block signers. Yeah, so there have been live transactions actually going back to the beta phase, and a number of the exchanges have integrated the technology. So I think, there are a lot of things to be released that build on this. So I think the people that will use it the fastest are people doing arbitrage. So there are some companies that trade with their own funds or with investors' funds, and some individuals that do that using their own funds. And for those people, they don't really typically need an interface. They're typically operating with APIs. So they do algo trading, or they'll use tools to do it, and they'll take arbitrage spreads and things like that. So Liquid is quite good for that because it allows funds to be moved much more quickly within a couple of minutes. So the Liquid network's block time is a minute, and because of the type of consensus algorithm it's using, it's guaranteed that it won't reorganize after two blocks. So in Bitcoin, it's probabilistic, so you can get reorganizations in principle, stretching out to 3, 4, 5 with increasingly low probability, such that many people accept 6 blocks for larger value transactions. So on Liquid, you can do that. It has fixed intervals, 1 minute, and you never need more than 2 blocks of confirmation. But obviously Liquid is making different trade-offs. So it's always going to be safer and more secure to store Bitcoin for long-term storage on the Bitcoin main chain.
So it sounds like we should anticipate users will be able to work with Liquid Bitcoin just as easily as Bitcoin at some point in the future?
Yeah, so actually to get Liquid Bitcoin, the advised way to do that is to get it from a participating exchange who would, move some Bitcoins from the main chain into the Liquid network and then basically swap them for Bitcoin. And then the user could withdraw them to a Liquid asset capable wallet. Technically, the user could peg them in themselves, but for security reasons, to take the coins out of Liquid and send them back into Bitcoin, the peg outs are done only to cold wallets operated by the participants, so the block signers. That's a sort of extra protection that there's a offline storage at the end of the peg out process. So another technical possibility is users could atomic swap, so or just swap on a friendly basis even, right? So if one user had liquid Bitcoin, another had Bitcoin, they could just both make a transaction and swap them. So there are ways to get in and out, via exchanges or just on a user basis. And actually, I mentioned confidential transactions earlier. So all of the transactions on Liquid are confidential by default, and the confidential transaction concept has been extended somewhat so that the type of a transaction, so the type of asset, is also encrypted. So when you look at a transaction in a Liquid Block Explorer, you won't be able to see, what the asset types are. So you won't be able to see the value or the asset type. So that's provides more kind of trading privacy. People don't want to give market signals. And actually, something people do is, you'll see people tweet about, oh, look, 20,000 Bitcoin went into Bitstamp or Bitfinex or something, and they take that as a trading signal. Probably they're going to get front run a little bit by doing that. So with Liquid, you can avoid that kind of giving out market signals before you trade.
So is there a public chain, but you just can't quite tell what's going on?
Yeah, so it's, people have used this taxonomy of private chain versus public chain. And usually what they mean by a private chain is that it's behind firewalls, it's on a VPN, and the public can't audit it. And there's, probably not a block explorer either. And the reasons for doing that are typically kind of control, So in the early days of the internet, companies were hesitant about connecting to the internet, and they would use intranets. So, and eventually they came around to using the public internet because it's a lot more valuable, and open networks tend to win over closed networks. So I think you can view the private chain as a kind of analog of the intranet thinking. So people haven't quite made the leap. And the other reason to use intranets for private chains is if you're not confident in the network security of the protocol, i.e. you're worried if you connect to the internet that it will get hacked. And so then you have a public chain, which is like Bitcoin, and Liquid is a public chain. However, because of the confidential transactions and confidential assets inventions that we implemented into it, it's kind of a bit of both, right? So it has confidentiality or financial privacy, but it's still publicly auditable. So, people that are running the full nodes, which, you as a power user could do, download a full node software and run it connected to the Liquid network. Your full node is telling you that, okay, all the values add up. We just can't tell what they are because of the kind of cryptographic proofs, these kind of special signatures. And similarly, we can't tell which asset is in this transaction, but we know that if 5 Bitcoins went in, 5 Bitcoins came out, and if 5 liquid US dollars went in, 5 liquid US dollars came out. And so we know that the amounts of each asset type add up. And that's enough to know that the chain has like financial integrity. So it's the bit that's sort of reduced is the transparency. And typically people's reaction to Bitcoin's level of transparency is that it's too transparent, right? It starts to become problematic for personal privacy, maybe even security, safety, right? Also for sort of traders and businesses to not want to give market signals revealing, their trading activity or what they're paying for inputs to their business, that kind of thing.
So if I was actually trading myself some liquid Bitcoin, though, I'd have some way to actually see my transaction and see the details on the chain?
Yes, good spot. So the information is visible to the sender and the receiver. So as receiver of a transaction, you learn what type the asset is and how many of them you received, and similarly the sender knows. Now, if you needed to, share it with your accountant, so that he could do your taxes after you've done all this trading. You could share a key with him that would allow him to look at it but not spend it, for example. So there's a separate key which keeps the information private.
Oh, and is there like a block size limit or anything?
There is. So the current, sidechains are not strongly scalability solutions, I would say, because it still has the same trade-off that Bitcoin has, which is it's got to be reasonably practical for power users and businesses to verify the chain. So it might not be quite as decentralized, like maybe the cost of verifying it is higher, and at capacity, Liquid would already be about 10 times the bandwidth of Bitcoin, and probably about 10 times the CPU cost, well, probably more than 10 times the CPU cost to verify, because it has a lot of crypto proofs in it, which are kind of a similar density of CPU time to verify as bytes to receive. So it's going to require a faster CPU and more bandwidth, but I think you would want a sidechain, like a public chain, to have a cost that's reasonable to verify. So a desktop CPU and kind of bandwidth that you can obtain relatively easily as a consumer. So Bitcoin is able to keep the bandwidth costs much lower and so achieve a greater degree of decentralization. And I guess another scalability issue is to add a new node to the network and have it catch up with the past. So that's probably going to be a bigger bottleneck than staying current once you're caught up. So that's another factor to keep in mind. And the other kind of factor is the UTXO set size. So there's a database of kind of partly in memory of currently unspent coins, and that has some lookup complexity. So if it gets way too big to fit in memory, it will slow the whole thing down as well.
Did you actually tell me what the block size limit is for Liquid Bitcoin?
So it's currently 1 megabyte every minute. We had an earlier test version that was doing 4 megabytes every minute, but we need to improve some communication protocols to make that not become a latency problem. So that's kind of another side effect of having lots of data in blocks, is it takes time to synchronize the information between people who are mining. So in Liquid, people are not mining, they're signing, but nevertheless, they need to receive block proposals from the other block signers in a timely fashion, or the minute target for blocks won't be met. And if you made 2 megabyte blocks and they took 2 minutes, you wouldn't have improved the throughput of the system. So before we can make an increase like that, we need to improve the efficiency of the communication protocols for synchronizing information. And there are techniques for doing that. They just haven't been fully implemented yet. So the other thing we can do, which is a kind of also similar vein to what Bitcoin does, is make things more space efficient. We are working on switching the confidential transactions to use bullet proofs, which provide smaller range proofs. So it makes the size per transaction smaller. So I should say that even though the Liquid blockchain's block rate of data in blocks per 10 minutes is about 10 times bigger than Bitcoin, the transaction rate isn't 10 times bigger. Transaction rate's probably around the same because the confidential transactions are generally about 10 times larger.
Do you, in your mind, have some idea how Liquid, the network, will grow, I guess, in the short term? I mean, do you see a lot of new signers? What are you anticipating?
I think, what we see is that the people doing trading are pretty enthusiastic to use it. So it's really going to be the quickest sale you make, is somebody who's doing arbitrage trading or cross-exchange trading with investor funds or with their own funds. Here's about Liquid, and they want to use it, like, can I use it tomorrow kind of question, right? And that's because if you've tried doing arbitrage, so by which I mean, you spot that the price on Bitstamp for a Bitcoin is $6,300 and the price on Bitfinex is $6,500, then if you are anyway long-term holding Bitcoin and you have some dollars available, you can kind of keep the same position but make a bit of money, right? Because you can take some Bitcoins and sell them for $6,500, and then you can buy the same number of Bitcoins on the other exchange for a lower price, and you make a small profit. The typical problem is that you need to transfer US dollars around, and that takes a long time, like 2 or 3 days. And by the time your money reaches the other side, the price has changed, and maybe the opportunity is not there anymore. It's a lot smaller than it was. So with Liquid, one can move money in a couple of minutes, which is much more reasonable for doing arbitrage. And another factor is that because of the high latency on moving funds, people will take the funds they have and divide it up across 2 or 3 or more exchanges so that they're ready to act if there was a price discrepancy. But that means their money is not working as hard because it's only able to work on the exchanges where there is an opportunity, and they have also money parked on other exchanges where there's no opportunity. That money won't, if they make 1% on a trade and only 10% of the money is making it because the other money is parked on exchanges that has no arbitrage opportunity right now, they're only actually making 0.1% return on their capital. So if they can move the money quickly, then it doesn't matter so much where they put it. They can send it to where it needs to go immediately on demand without the latency. So another input into this, I should say as well, is that you need fiat coins. So things like Tether, and there are a number of new entrants as well, like Gemini, US dollars, Circle has one. There are many entrants at the moment. And to have those in Liquid, which is, you can use the asset issuance features of Liquid to do that. And some of the coins are already multi-network. So the same fiat coin is available on different network technologies. So we're working with a few different people to add fiat currencies to Liquid.
So, and I didn't even know they were on different chains, I guess. Is that just centrally managed, or is there some kind of an atomic swap going on? Or I don't mean to get too off track on that, but...
Yeah, I think that what would happen is the issuer would redeem and reissue on the other network. So it would be like a service, basically, because it's on a different network. Now, technically, it would be possible to kind of peg the coins. So there's a peg between the Bitcoin network and a Liquid network for moving Bitcoins into Liquid Bitcoins and vice versa. With fiat coins, it's more like an IOU, right? Because you're relying on the issuer to have US dollars in a bank account one-to-one. Nevertheless, if there is a token on one type of chain, depending on the details, you may be able to move it to Liquid by essentially doing a proof of burn, right? So if somebody is saying that, okay, I have a token on another network that represents a US dollar, and I present to an issuer on Liquid evidence that I have spent that coin to an address that's like all zeros or something, so an invalid address, then the issuer can give me a new coin.
Can I dig into that real quick?
Mm-hmm.
Based on some stuff from Craig Wright, but also just the idea that in the future, as technology progresses, lost keys will someday be able to be, I guess, kind of brute forced or whatever new technology there is. Are there addresses that for sure can never be figured out ever in the future?
Yeah, basically. So the default address format in Bitcoin is the hash of a public key. So even quantum computers don't fare very well, which is far from certain, right? That we will have practical quantum computers within a few decades even. So even that wouldn't directly affect the hashed address. So typically what they would do is to do a proof of burn, which is this protocol's called, is to just have a hash that's all zeros, and then it will be impractical to find a pre-image of the hash that is also a valid public key that you know the private key for. So people have talked about the kind of very far future, and some people have put effort into thinking about how you would migrate to new signature schemes were that to happen. And we think it's like reasonably practical to just switch to a new signature scheme. So there are post-quantum secure signature schemes like Lamport signatures. And complete aside is the Byzantine generals problem is also by Lamport. It's kind of early computer science guy who's very prolific. Also did LaTeX, the typesetting system. So with the signature schemes, Johnson Lau had proposed that you would basically migrate to a new signature scheme, and you would sort of prove knowledge of something about the previous signature, and then that would introduce your new key, and then you'd be able to spend it with the new signature scheme. So there are reasonably practical ways to migrate signature schemes. And I mean, in a sense, Bitcoin is going through that at the moment because people are working on Schnorr signatures, which are an improved variant of ECDSA signatures. And actually, Schnorr signatures came first. Kind of ECDSA is a slightly inferior variant of it.
And I think I just listened to a podcast recently saying there was some patent that kept Schnorr signatures out of Bitcoin for a while. Is that right?
That's indeed what was going on. So, I mean, that was I think, it's not the official story, obviously, but I think basically the reason that DSA even exists was to avoid paying for the Schnorr patent by like standards bodies and NIST and different people. So, and that goes back, 15 years or something when that was going on. But the Schnorr patent expired coincidentally right about the time Bitcoin was launched. But it was less well known because it wasn't the standard for patent reasons, but it's actually a slightly better signature scheme with a number of advantages.
Gotcha. And I got you off track from Liquid asking about how people change chains, and then I got you off track again asking about the burning. So
I mean, we were talking about use cases and adoption.
And you were talking about how traders would want to use it, but would they also tend to want to be signers on whatever you call that?
Block signers. Well, functionaries is another word we use because it's a kind of unattended functionary behavior, right? It's not a discretionary behavior. There's a box with some software in it and some hardware that has keys in it, a hardware module. So it's some kind of combined box that they would just power up on a network in a similar secured location that they would store their servers with hot wallets for an exchange on, for example. So I think for typical traders, they wouldn't, need to be a functionary or block signer. And actually, there are scalability reasons why it's difficult to have too many block signers. It becomes harder there's more bandwidth and latency if you bring lots of participants. There's some kind of n-squared communication protocol to reach consensus in there. So we can go higher than we are today, but there are some limits. More than maybe 100 or 2 would be pushing it for efficiency, and then you'd start to get slower blocks or a lot of bandwidth in the consensus part of the protocol. So, I mean, the interest for, let's say, a big exchange to be a functionary is to sort of participate in the security of the system. So I'd say the security mostly applies to the liquid Bitcoins because they are on a Bitcoin side when they're pegged, because it's a federated chain. It's the pegs in Bitcoins. If you look at them on the Bitcoin side of the network, when they're suspended while they're being used on the liquid network, the Bitcoins are in a threshold signature. So like an 11 of 15 signature. And those 11 keys the 15 keys are stored inside the hardware modules of the functionaries. And the number will change as people add it to the network over time. But it's for consensus protocol reasons, it has to be greater than 2/3 of the participants need to sign blocks to make them valid. So it's the same kind of threshold for storing the Bitcoins. So when they get pegged out, then you need 2/3 of the block signers to release the coins in reaction to a signed request by one of the liquid participants to move the coins out. So as to why somebody's motivation to run a block signer, I think if you are holding a lot of client funds or a lot of investor funds, that by being part of it, you can add your own security practices. So if you feel you have a good secure data center, qualified security staff, and secure facility where the equipment is, and you feel that the other participants, or at least 2/3 of them do, then you'll feel more confident about the network security. So, it's a kind of peer-to-peer network in a larger sense, right, where the peers are a set of companies. So you're sort of participating to increase strength of the network, and you're also relying on the network. So you're sort of being a good citizen in a way to add network security because you rely on network security. So you've got skin in the game because you've got client funds or your own funds. And so you have an incentive to perform your part of the security picture.
A quick message from our sponsor. BTC Inc. is excited to announce its upcoming conference, Distributed Health, November 5th and 6th in Nashville, Tennessee. This is the first conference to bridge the gap between blockchain technology and the healthcare industry. Now in its third year, this two-day event is an opportunity for all members of the ecosystem, including payers, providers, lawmakers, retailers, investors, and innovators to reshape the future of healthcare. For more information, visit health.distributed.com and use the promo code BTCGame20 to secure a 20% discount. The Bitcoin Game is also sponsored by BTCKeychain.com, probably the most well-known Bitcoin keychains in the world. Get your own, just go to BTCKeychain.com. Should people worry at all that a federated system is more susceptible to government pressure, or that a small number of signers, relatively small, could be attacked? I don't know, denial of service attack or something to kind of gum up the system?
So a number of questions in there. So going backwards, the denial of service attack, the block signers are protected behind Tor, which does two things. It hides their physical location, which makes it harder for people to locate them in order to know where to, which building to break into to find the server, kind of thing. And Tor also provides some denial of service protection because you can't make a direct TCP connection to it. So there are some denial of service countermeasures. And in terms of sort of breaking into them, so the security model is such that, so there are two tracks to the security story. One is for liquid assets and one is for liquid Bitcoin. So liquid assets are defined within the system. So because other participants are running full nodes, it's kind of like in Bitcoin, right? If a miner mines an invalid block that tries to respend a transaction or create some coins that don't exist, it doesn't matter that much because all of the other full nodes will reject the block and miners will build on the longest valid block. So the same kind of story applies to liquid, right? So for liquid assets, the full nodes are protecting the integrity of the chain. So, if somebody were to compromise the signers, all the signers are doing is ordering the transactions, but the full nodes are verifying everything. So there's not really much that somebody could do by compromising a server as far as liquid assets are concerned. So the security for liquid Bitcoin is more complicated, and there it does matter. If people were able to compromise enough servers, they could potentially peg out the coins without there being a valid signed request from a liquid Bitcoin holder. So we take some extra precautions there. So the peg out addresses are cold addresses, so they're offline air-gapped, and that's why the procedure to remove, to peg out Bitcoins from liquid involves using an exchange or partnering with somebody who has a block signer. So the coins can be pegged out only to a cold address, and the keys that sign to approve that peg out are in a hardware module. So it's already challenging because of the security measures to compromise the host operating system of the block signer server. But it's even harder to compromise the hardware module because it's connected over a restricted electrical connection, and it's in a physical box. So you need to get physical access to the box, and the box is in a data center sitting beside the server that has the exchange's hot wallet and lots of funds in it, right? So it's going to be in a secure location, and you need to compromise 2/3 of them to get the funds. So you made a comment about sort of exposure to, I guess, court decisions, things like that. So basically, the participants are exchanges. So businesses are generally going to be responsive to requests. So leaving money on an exchange. If the exchange receives a call order to do something that could affect your funds. But in terms of the kind of continued uptime and service guarantees and not having contagion if one exchange receives an order for something to other exchanges, the factors there are that the block signer or functionary servers are in different countries. So they're spread across, I think, 6 or 7 different countries, typically between 1 and 3 exchanges per country. So to actually sort of shut it down, it's quite difficult because it would need coordinated political will in multiple countries. And ultimately what it's doing is facilitating exchange trading activity where typically people that are trading with the exchange, they have to provide information to the exchange, and the exchange is a company. So if there are legal requests, the first port of call is the court in the relevant country would talk to the exchange, and that's something that presumably happens, today. Because of that, I don't think there would be a strong value to even trying to shut it down.
I guess my highly theoretical question was a concerted effort with multiple countries. Hey, for reasons I can't think of right now, we want this whole network shut down your servers. Just something that I guess wouldn't be as easy with Bitcoin.
So there is one more line of defense on the Bitcoin side. So we treat the liquid assets, which are native, differently from liquid Bitcoins, which are special in being digitally verifiable scarce assets from the Bitcoin chain and distinct from any other kind of issued asset. So for the liquid assets, the story is that in this eventuality that the network shuts down, basically if too many functionaries go offline, it doesn't reach its quorum of the threshold number of signatures that need to sign blocks for them to be valid. So it stops operating. And at that point, all of the people with full nodes the power users with full nodes or the remaining businesses can decide on a new federation, start a new network, import the state of the network, and continue. So there's technical coordination that's not an automated thing, but if there remain a group of people interested to use those assets, they can start another network. And because it's an open network and there's coordination, everybody knows basically what the longest valid chain is, and so they can start a new network with new block signers, basically. For Bitcoin, it's a little more complicated because recall there are Bitcoins stored on a multisig on the keys in these hardware wallets. So if the network stopped signing blocks, it wouldn't be possible to peg out the coins without the cooperation, offline cooperation of some of those participants to get up to the threshold. However, there is also another withdrawal system, which is a 2 of 3 signature, which is disabled until such time as the network stops operating for a design of 4 weeks. The way that works, so the peg-in transactions are, they're escrowed Bitcoins on the Bitcoin chain. There'll be peg-ins and peg-outs, so they get moved forward, right? So all of the coins in a previous peg-in get spent to a new peg-in. And so every time that happens, which will be, multiple times per hour, there'll be a new coin on the Bitcoin network. And there's a very small script or smart contract attached to the peg-in coins, which is not just today an 11 of 15 transaction. It's also an 11 of 15 signature from the block signers, or 4 weeks have passed and 2 of 3 transaction. So that means basically as long as the network is operating, those 2 of 3 signers are never able to sign because the expiry period for that to become a valid signature never happens because it keeps getting pushed off into the future by the network's operation, basically. But if the network were to stop operating for 4 weeks, design is 4 weeks, obviously that's a parameter for a system. Eventually, after 4 weeks, those keys become valid, and then they can be used to pay the Bitcoins out to the participants.
I didn't quite exactly follow that all, but maybe I will if I listen to this a second time. Basically, you're saying there's a way it would work after 4 weeks, it sounds like you're saying.
I mean, it's kind of like an electronic version of a dead man switch, which is sort of, if one person dies, after some time, some information becomes available. So in this case, if these functionaries stop responding, then after 4 weeks, something else can happen. But before then, the other thing, it can't happen because it's prevented by the operation of the network. So it's good because it means that the secondary withdrawal mechanism doesn't become a operational security consideration because it's not active until it's necessary. And so those keys can be stored, very offline, cold, physically secure places.
So are these just the functionaries that would have these keys, or would I, if I had some liquid Bitcoin wallet, would I have a way to get my Bitcoin back if that happened?
No, so today it's more like the functionaries kind of arrangement where there are 3 independent parties who would physically store those keys. We're not disclosing where for operational security reasons, but it can be possible to do sort of unilateral withdrawal, but that's an area for future research, basically, which is what you're saying that, that each user could take their funds out. So I think it's closer to possible for each exchange to take their funds out, which could be an interesting incremental step forward. So there's lots of interesting applied R&D that can be done to incrementally improve the system from here. So, we'll be already quite busy with releasing a number of software projects and services related to it. So one of the services is Block Explorer, and actually source code for the Block Explorer. And there are 2 Block Explorers. So one is written in NBitcoin, which is a C# Bitcoin library by an independent developer, Nicolas Dorier. So he's extending that to work with Liquid. So you can program with Bitcoin using C#, but then you'll also be able to program with C# on Liquid. So there's a Block Explorer. There is a Bitcoin wallet. Blockstream has a Bitcoin wallet called Green Address. So we'll soon be releasing a version of that is able to handle liquid assets. And we're also working with Ledger and Trezor, the hardware wallet manufacturers, to implement liquid asset support in the hardware wallets so that you can, as a trader, you can take liquid assets and liquid Bitcoin off an exchange to store in a hardware wallet, because that's a kind of more secure way to store assets. It's not really very advisable to store Bitcoins and other crypto assets on a online connected laptop or something.
And are you trying to keep all the functionaries, like exchanges that are definitely very KYC compliant and all that?
So my impression is basically most exchanges today have brought in practices and are improving their practices. Obviously, that's a source of friction for customers. So in the same way that people sign up for pay-as-you-go mobiles, and the reason people offer pay-as-you-go mobiles is that, the reason mobile telephone companies offer that is it's a lower friction way to sign up, right? You can just go in with some cash and buy and start. So it remains to be seen, how that evolves. But I would say that the current set of functionaries are exchanges with current practices, and some of them are obviously proprietary traders. So they're just a company that trades on their own behalf or on behalf of their investors. So the customer is themselves in that case. But that's the exchanges that are using Liquid, where the liquid assets and liquid Bitcoin are things that users can transact. They can store in wallets, or they can transact on the Liquid network in a similar way that you would transact a Bitcoin on a Bitcoin network. So, peer-to-peer respendable assets are more permissionless. You just transfer them to a wallet. So the way that the Bitcoin world has evolved is that the interface to banks and wire transfers and fiat money and identity has evolved to be the exchanges, right? So it's a similar kind of situation with Liquid.
Paul Stork has been somewhat critical. He doesn't think Liquid is a real sidechain to him. Do you have any thoughts or response to his criticisms?
So actually, we were talking about that online, Paul Stork and myself and a few other people, and I think the term sidechain is actually an older term, like that predates the two-way peg sidechain concepts. And originally, I think it just meant generally that there's one blockchain like Bitcoin, and there's some chain that is sort of associated with it in some way. Like, it's technically connected to the first chain by looking at its information or by being merged mined with it or something. So it was a quite flexible term, meaning basically related chain. And I think it might have been me that chose that term to mean this two-way peg chain. So recall the thought process. I was like talking with people on IRC, what is the correct word to use? The closest one I see is this sidechain concept, because this looks like this two-way peg connected chain could be described as a sidechain based on the kind of loose meaning at the time. So I think historically it's come to mean a broad range of things, including, merge mined sidechains, which is another trade-off that DriveChain is using, which is Paul Stork's project. And the rootstock sidechain is a hybrid, actually. So it's using something like Functionaries, so threshold and mining with some kind of switchover in between. I think it's just a different trade-off. The original two-way peg concept has the challenge that the majority of miners, so we were describing in the federated model that ultimately if 2/3 or more of the hardware modules were physically compromised, that somebody could take the funds. And so that's why we've, sought to work with exchanges and people with physical security expertise, because they're managing hot wallets or client funds. But with the original two-way peg sidechain, which is based on merge mining, 2/3 of the miners could take the funds. And so people's concern there is like, well, mining is quite centralized at times, and people can rent hash rates. How secure that is in practice, it's hard to evaluate. Certainly more convincing as mining becomes more decentralized. And so what Paul introduced to combat that with drive chains is a slow withdrawal. So I believe he has a 3-month withdrawal period. So the idea is that if miners did try to take the pegged coins, you'd have 3 months to watch it happen. And presumably the technical community could develop a patch to prevent that in-flight theft, and the user community would be motivated to adopt a patch to prevent the theft because it would impact Bitcoin, or certainly impact the sidechain, I should say. And so that's the trade-off, right? So it has a trade-off that you have a quite slow withdrawal. So there are some complicated trade-offs, and I think there are some interesting hybrids in between as well. So we'll see how it evolves.
Anything else you want to talk about liquid Bitcoin?
I suppose the other concept that people ask about is, what's the difference between liquid and lightning, or why would one use liquid versus lightning for different use cases? Some people have thought that one could use lightning, make a simplified topology where there's an exchange. So the exchange is kind of the only lightning node in this topology. And all the users make channels to it, and then they transfer funds to the exchange. And when they want to make a withdrawal, the exchange transfers it back. And that could be done trustlessly on a channel. And so people were thinking, well, maybe that would be an interesting technology for exchanges, because it's also very fast, right? But the challenge, it has a couple of challenges. So one of them is that the funds on the channels tend to be hot. Maybe you could work around that some way. Exchanges like to put most of the funds cold for security reasons. And the other thing is that in a Lightning network, there's recirculation and routability because the average transaction is commensurate with the size of the channel capacities, right? So if the average channel capacity is $100 and the average transaction is $10, or $1,000 and $100 respectively, then your transactions can get routed lots of places. There's enough channel capacity, and it will recirculate and be able to respond to needs to make payments. But a typical exchange transaction pattern is that you've got a long tail of users, right? You've got some active users and some inactive, fairly dormant users, and people in between. And at any time, one user can wire transfer an immense amount of money to the exchange and expect to withdraw immediately. And so it's not really feasible for the exchange to have that kind of capacity on channels, because it's more Bitcoin than it's going to have in total under cold storage management, because you've got this kind of demand withdraw pattern. And so even this star network, with a central node being exchange, doesn't really satisfy the usage pattern very well. So maybe analogous in the Lightning network to, what does it have today, about 100 Bitcoin capacity, to people expecting that one user can walk up one day and say, I want 100 Bitcoins. So either that's going to empty the whole network, but it's not going to do that because that user won't have, more than a few channels with small capacity connected to it. So it won't be able to receive more than the sum of those channel capacities. So I think the usage pattern is not sort of normalized enough for that to be practical. So Liquid makes different trade-offs. So it's federated, where Lightning in principle has more trustlessness, right? There is some online risk, and you should monitor channel closures, hostile channel closures. So it's a bit of a reactive security model. So not as good for cold storage as Bitcoin, but it's not able to satisfy spiky large transactions, which Liquid can do because there are no channel capacities. So the full kind of coin holdings of an exchange or of users can be accessed and sent to any other address in the system on demand.
When do you think Lightning will be something that just a very novice user can take advantage of sending and receiving Lightning funds?
So I think some of the smartphone wallets are getting pretty easy to use. So we work with an independent developer called Nadav Igvi, whose online handle is Shesek, and he made it's called Lightning Spark. So it's a smartphone wallet, and it's technically a remote control for a Lightning node. So the keys and the assets are in the Lightning node, which you run on computer at home or something, and then you connect your Lightning Spark remote control to your Lightning node, and you can make payments with it. So it's pretty easy to use. It's got a nice user interface. But I think one of the complexities, there's starting to be more stores that accept Lightning, so that helps. And there's a couple of exchanges that have started supporting topping up your Lightning wallet, so like adding funds to your Lightning wallet so you can withdraw from an exchange or deposit from an exchange using Lightning. But one of the complexities is the backwards and forwards compatibility between Bitcoin and Lightning. And today that's a little bit of a complicated user experience. So the Lightning version 1.5, I'm not sure if that's its official version, but the next version is called L2 that people are working on, has design extensions to deal with mixing Bitcoin transactions and Lightning transactions. So basically the technical mechanisms they have are splice in and splice out. So splice out is if you and I have a channel open between us and we want to pay Bob, who doesn't have a Lightning wallet, we can pay that. All we have to do is we both sign to take some of our shared channel capacity off of the Bitcoin transaction that's underneath it and pay it to Bob. So they're adding features to do that. And splice in is that you can give a user that doesn't have Lightning a Bitcoin address where they can increase the channel balance in your favor. So obviously there are different protocol details which are intricate to make that work in practice. But once that is working, it'll work well because you'll be able to have a smartphone wallet that can receive Lightning Bitcoin or on-chain Bitcoin and can send Lightning Bitcoin or on-chain Bitcoin interchangeably and not really, from a simple user interface, really make a big distinction between the two.
And you won't have to be running something on your home computer or something?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the Lightning software is, you can run a full node or you can run a kind of constrained full node. So there are a number of different types of nodes today. So you can run a full node or you can run a SPV node, which is typically some of the older smartphone wallets were SPVs.
So we're talking Bitcoin, not Lightning right now, right?
Yes. So the SPV protocol, you only download the headers of the Bitcoin chain, which is quite a small amount of data, and then you kind of semi-trust other nodes and spot check and download blocks for transactions you care about. And it's not very good for privacy because you're typically using third-party full nodes rather than your own. Some of the wallets support overriding it to connect to your own wallet. The Green Dress one does that. I think the Samurai wallet can do that too. So that's an improvement. But there's a new protocol that was developed for Lightning, which is an improved SPV protocol called Neutrino. So it's kind of part of the overall protocol specification for Lightning that all the implementations are adding. So the idea there is it's more privacy preserving than SPV because you download filters for the block and then you search them locally instead of asking a random node on the network. So you could reasonably make some security trade-offs to run a neutrino node on your smartphone and drive Lightning off that. And there's also the concept of a, what's it called, a watchtower, like a third-party node that you don't have to trust very much, but alerts you if somebody's trying to close a channel when they shouldn't be, and handles that for you. So it's possible to use it with different bandwidth profiles. And I mean, also smartphone bandwidth is and CPU power is not so bad. So Lawrence Nahum, who's was the CEO of Green Address, has something called AB Core, which is a Bitcoin full node that runs on an Android phone. So you can actually run your own full node on an Android phone and connect your smartphone wallet to it. Now, it's pruned, which means it doesn't keep too much old information, but it is a full node and it's verifying everything. So you probably want to do the bulk of your syncing on Wi-Fi. But you could actually do it on 3G if you have a good plan. So Neutrino is definitely lighter than something like that. It's sort of closer to the SPV bandwidth use. So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Some people debate about whether everybody should run a full node or nobody should run a full node or somewhere in between. And I think my view is it's important for it to be possible for people to run a full node and for a reasonable number of users to use one or rely on one they trust. Sometimes some of the more modern smartphone wallets typically do a bit of both. So they semi-trust full node operated by the wallet provider, and then the software cross-checks with full nodes using SPV or Neutrino, or you can configure it optionally to cross-check with your own full node. So I think it's important that it be possible to run a full node and that a reasonable number of people do. And the reason is that you want to catch forgeries quickly. So, if 10% of people are referring to full nodes, then somebody who isn't, is using a very old wallet with SPV and got fooled, the next payment they make will, on average, after a few hops, be somebody who's checking. Like they'll make an exchange deposit and the exchange will say it's not a valid coin. Or they'll make a payment to another person whose wallet checks with a full node and they'll say it's not a valid coin. So as long as you catch protocol cheating quickly, it becomes unattractive to do it or tends towards being prevented a priori. It doesn't have to be everybody, but it should be practical because otherwise you're trusting people, basically.
Do you feel there's kind of not keeping to that ethos if you're using a hardware wallet since, you're, I guess, having to trust Trezor or Ledger's systems?
Actually, the security model of hardware wallets is very interesting. It's counterintuitive. So the keys are generated on and stay in the hardware wallet. That's good. The transactions are signed on the hardware wallet and the keys never leave the wallet. Also good. Now, the intuition is kind of weird, but the hardware wallet's full node, the manufacturer runs a full node, and the hardware wallet sort of connects to it via some web integrated software. If you use their default wallets, you can also plug the hardware wallets into other software stacks like Green Address and Electrum, both support hardware wallets natively. Then you actually rely on your own full node or the Green Address full node and so on. But if you're using the Ledger or Trezor full node that they provide through the web wallet, their full node can't cheat you. So there's two possibilities. If the full node sends you a valid transaction that exists and so on, and that you have keys to spend, then when you sign it, it will be accepted by the network as a valid transaction. Whereas, if they sent you, some coins that didn't exist, or because you can't really check because the hardware wallet really doesn't have an external view of the world. The trick is that the rest of the Bitcoin network would reject it. Counterintuitively, you're really not trusting that full node very much, particularly if you check the main things you need to check on the display of the hardware wallet is the amount of money you're paying and the address you're paying it to. And the hardware wallet will check locally for itself that the change of a transaction is going to keys it controls, basically. So with that combination, you're fairly safe against malicious behavior.
I guess I was trying to compare in my mind, and maybe I'm not getting something, trusting like a SPV wallet for incoming funds versus trusting your Trezor Ledger the way most people use them for incoming funds.
You wouldn't typically look at the Trezor to show the funds, and what the block explorer they provide shows you, or the web wallet could be lying to you. So you should really cross-check that, on a full node, or cross-check it independently on different locations. There are some read-only smartphone wallets that can let you monitor the coins that are received by Trezor, and you can connect that to a full node. So Samurai has one called Sentinel. You can configure it. I think you can configure it to point to your own full node. That would be a way to check. You can give it the XPub or YPub, which is kind of all of the keys that the hardware wallet knows about. But you're right. That's a weak point. Receiving is a weak point.
I guess I'm just trying to understand if I am understanding correctly. It sounds like I am with my limited grasp. Okay. You've been on with me quite a while, so we can call it here, whatever you're feeling.
Yeah, so I guess we could call it. I'm just kind of conscious about not putting out a marathon, so chopping it in half. And I feel like if we keep going, we might be chopping it in 3 parts.
Well, I know I'm happy to cut it in half. I got to tell you, I don't put out a ton of episodes. I started the podcast in 2014 when there wasn't a lot of Bitcoin content. And I felt good about it because I felt like, hey, I'm really adding something. But now there's so much good content out there. I sometimes feel like, why am I doing this? And this is why I'm doing this, because I somehow get to luck out and have a conversation with someone like you, which is crazy to me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, well, thanks for inviting me to discuss and talk about all these things. And I mean, I think, doing the podcast is useful to, Bitcoin and related technologies are quite complicated. So it's pretty useful for people to be able to absorb the information and hear discussion.
Well, hopefully other people can get a lot out of this like I did. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Back.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed part 2 of my interview with Dr. Adam Back. Even after this interview, I realize I'm left with so many more questions for Dr. Back. I guess that's just how it is for someone who's been involved in this space for so long before Bitcoin and is CEO of one of the most influential businesses in the space. If you want to say hello, I'm the BTC Game on Twitter, and you can leave a comment on this episode's show notes page at thebitcoingame.com. Just look for episode 60. See you next time.